Okay, we'll start with this. Later on this month,
26.
Australian amateur standout Skye Nicolson will be making her next ring appearance on the undercard of Warrington versus Martinez 2. Skye made her professional debut earlier this month on the 5th. Now she's going to be in action on the tail end of it yet again on the 26th, attempting to advance to a professional record of 2-0.
2 fights in the same month.
That's productive. On this kind of schedule, we could see Skye Nicolson 3, maybe even 4 more times before this year is out, as they step her up in competition gradually.
She made her U.S. debut and a pro debut
Against the then unbeaten Jessica Juarez of the United States, who going into that fight sported a professional record of 3 wins, no losses, and no draws.
Ambitious matchmaking for Skye Nicolson.
They could have matched her against another fighter making their pro debut, or some Chinese woman with an upside-down record, but they chose to match her against a young unbeaten fighter in all the ways that she's a young unbeaten fighter.
Except the girl that she was fighting had at least 3 pro fights, 3 pro victories.
You have to wonder if they won't look to reschedule what was supposed to be the Skye Nicolson versus Brie Howling fight. Initially, that's who Skye Nicolson was supposed to be making her professional debut against.
Perhaps not for later on this month, but at a later date.
The image below is from Brie Howling's social media, her Instagram account. You'll notice the hashtags, April 30th. That's when Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano is set to go down in New York City, Madison Square Garden. Should we expect to see Brie Howling on that undercard?
You think they're rescheduling Nicholson versus Howling?
They might be. What we know is that Skye Nicholson's next ring appearance is going down later on this month, and perhaps what the people at Matchroom want to do is allow Skye a little bit more time to garner some professional experience before they put her in there with Brie Howling, because Brie Howling,
she seems a more put-together fighter than a Jessica Juarez.
Jessica Juarez, who, going into that Skye Nicolson fight, she was an unbeaten fighter the same way that Brie Howling still is an unbeaten fighter, but I told you, she seems a little bit more rough around the edges, a little bit more crude, still needs more work, whereas Brie Howling has the look of a more experienced, maturated, more complete fighter than Jessica Juarez.
So maybe what the people at Matchroom are doing are allowing Skye to have 1 or 2 more fights.
Before they so decide to throw her in there with Brie Howling, that might be the situation, that might be the case. In any event,
Skye Nicolson is set to return to action later on this month.
Solid professional debut for the 26-year-old Australian amateur standout. We saw movement, we saw sharpshooting, boxing from the outside. I'd like to see a straight left hand.
I want to see Skye Nicolson assert herself a little more.
She showed a lot of polished boxing in her pro debut, a lot of finesse fighting, but in the pro game, there are those moments where you have to assert yourself. You have to stand your ground.
Gotta let your hands go.
Skye Nicholson's sweet spot seems to be boxing from the outside, behind her jab, behind straight shots, straight punches from the outside at a safe distance. I'd like to see what Skye can do mid-range to inside, in the pocket. And I ain't one of these guys who's overly critical of young fighters that are still making their bones as professionals. Quite the opposite.
I'm understanding.
So now that we've seen what Skye can do from the outside, I'd like to see what she's capable of doing mid-range to inside.
To further evaluate this fighter,
Skye Nicolson ain't the only Australian import that's going to be boxing on the undercard of Warrington versus Martinez 2. We're also going to see Ebanie Bridges, who is now vying for the IBF bantamweight title, the blue belt, against Argentinia's own Maria Cecilia Roman.
that's going to be a good fight.
Ebanie Bridges, who took to her social media and stated, "Some haters are seriously obsessed with me, LMFAO, and the lengths they go to. It's embarrassing, like, get a life. Ha ha ha. Hashtag living rent free. Hashtag obsessed with the bomber." I'd name and shame them, but then they get more attention. And the reason they're doing what they're doing is because no one gives a fuck about them. Salty as fuck. They've been around forever and no one talks about them. LOL.
It's not a secret that Ebanie Bridges isn't everyone's cup of tea.
She faced some criticism for being afforded a world title shot, a world title opportunity way back when against Shannon Courtenay for what was the WBA bantamweight title. There were a lot of people out there, they felt that Ebanie Bridges didn't deserve to be boxing for an alphabet title of any kind, even a vacant one. In this situation on the 26th, she's being afforded a world title shot, a world title opportunity by a reigning champion, Maria Cecilia Roman. In the eyes of Ebanie's critics, should she win, this should, in theory, legitimize her.
There's people out there, they feel that the only reason she's getting so far is because of her looks, not a boxer.
But once that opening bell sounds and she's opposite the ring Maria Cecilia Roman, a pleasing aesthetic, that won't do her much good. It's going to be her boxing that sees her through that fight, because Maria Cecilia Roman has reigned as this division's IBF bantamweight champion since 2017. 6
official defenses of the IBF title.
Maria Cecilia Roman has boxed approximately 8 times since having become this division's IBF champion. Those 6 out of the 8 were official defenses of the IBF title. Essentially what I'm getting at is, this is no...
This ain't some newly crowned champion.
Some greenhorn who just got a belt. This ain't no squirrely amateur. This is a highly experienced fighter, an experienced champion that Ebanie Bridges will be facing later on this month. And if she makes it through that fight and pries the blue belt away from Argentina's Maria Cecilia Roman, her critics, they're gonna have to find something else to criticize her about.
Because that same old shtick about her not being a real fighter.
It will be proven invalid if she manages to pry the blue belt away from Maria Cecilia Roman. There are those on both sides of the business, fight fans and some fighters themselves, that have reserved the right to lambast Ebanie Bridges for how she markets herself.
Whether it's jealousy or just criticism.
If she can unseat a long-reigning champion in this division, I'd say that will legitimize her as a fighter. She's going to be in action on the undercard of Warrington versus Martinez 2 against Maria Cecilia Roman, and her countrywoman, Olympic amateur standout Skye Nicholson, she's going to be boxing against an opponent that is yet to be announced as well. Look for that later on this month. In other news, the Boo Birds' criticisms are still pouring in for Canelo Alvarez's 2-fight engagement, his 2-fight deal with Matchroom.
He's supposed to box Dmitry Bivol next at light heavyweight, then Gennady Golovkin at super middleweight.
A Twitter user that goes by the name Pretty Boy OD stated, "I think Triple G won both fights, but I ask you the same question y'all asked Jermall Charlo, David Benavidez, and Demetrius Andrade. Who has Triple G beat to deserve a Canelo fight when he ducked Charlo and Andrade and got beat up by Derevyanchenko and has been fighting in weak fights? So why not give Charlo his first chance? The fact is, Triple G didn't beat Canelo, and he hasn't beat anyone good in years. So what's the difference between him, Charlo, Andrade, or Benavidez? And the difference is simple. A fight with Triple G is of a greater financial value than a fight with any of them. Triple G still is the biggest name in the middleweight division, and it just so happens that he's very close to going into a mega fight in the Far East with Ryota Murata. A bigger fight than any fight that Jermall Charlo's been in, David Benavidez, or Demetrius Andrade. If what this individual is asking is the difference between fighting Triple G and fighting those guys, the difference is simple. It's a bigger fight.
It's a bigger money fight with a bigger name.
And this guy, this Pretty Boy OD guy, he's either playing dumb or he is dumb. Whether you like it or not, Triple G is still the biggest name in today's middleweight division due to the inaction of fighters like Jermall Charlo, who had the opportunity to unify titles with Demetrius Andrade.
Oh, he turned his nose up at that. We talk about it often here on the channel.
Do you realize that at 40 years old, Triple G is closer to becoming this division's unified champion yet again than either Jermall Charlo or Demetrius Andrade? These guys that Pretty Boy OD is so enamored with. Do you realize that Jermall Charlo had the same kind of opportunity to become this division's unified champion and further enhance his profile? He had the same chance Triple G had.
With a different champion.
All the same. The opportunity to become this division's latest unified champion was laid at the feet of Jermall Charlo, and Jermall spat on it. He thought he was too good to box Demetrius Andrade, and look at where that's gotten him. Boxing a guy that Demetrius Andrade beat years ago.
Oh, I'd call that karma is what I'd call that.
He thought he could hold out and play it safe. Perhaps he wins the Canelo Alvarez sweepstakes, and that didn't work out. And when that didn't work out, he sought an alternative in Jaime Munguia. And that fizzled out as well. So here today, he's set to box a guy that Demetrius Andrade already dealt with. Demetrius Andrade, who he thought he was too good to swap punches with. Apparently not. Not when you're swapping punches with guys that he beat already.
And before you go poo-pooing all over Canelo for fighting Gennady Golovkin.
That same Gennady Golovkin that you're poo-pooing all over, he'd be the best name on Jermall Charlo's resume so far. And Demetrius Andrade's and David Benavidez's resume, though.
A lot of them.
All three. What people at Showtime wouldn't give to be able to bring a big-name guy over, big-name guy like a Gennady Golovkin, to box either a Jermall Charlo or a David Benavidez.
They wish.
You think Demetrius Andrade wouldn't kill to land himself a Gennady Golovkin fight? A big-name fight with a big big-name fighter like Gennady Golovkin, what guys like Pretty Boy OD don't seem to want to understand is that here today in 2022, Gennady Golovkin is still the biggest name in today's middleweight division because guys like Jermall Charlo...
They didn't do anything to eclipse him.
I'll give you an example. Jermall Charlo boxed only once the whole of last year, and that was in June of last year against the C-Class Juan Montiel. He hasn't done a hell of a lot since then. He could have squeezed in another fight before last year was out, but he didn't do that. So he was last in action in June of last year against the C-Class fighter, and here he is...
Set to return in June of this year.
Against yet another C-Class fighter. Maybe a C+. This is a guy who already got beat by Daniel Jacobs, beat by Demetrius Andrade, put on his back pocket by Gabe Rosado. This is who Jermall Charlo is fighting, and there is roughly 12 months between those two fights.
Or there will be when June gets here, because June is when they're doing that fight.
Think about Jermall Charlo's schedule of activity. He boxed only once in 2020, only once in 2021, and since he last boxed in 2021, there's going to be roughly a year's time in between both of those fights. His lone fight in 2021 and his next fight in 2022. That kind of schedule don't do you notoriety any favors. Doesn't keep people talking about you.
And it doesn't help that he couldn't even knock a guy out in his last fight.
Guys like Pretty Boy OD who don a cape and cap for these part-time fighters, inactive, irrelevant fighters.
What the fuck are you so enamored with? What's the point?
Well, it's tribalism that motivates him, not boxing. From a boxing perspective, Jermall Charlo is no fighter to write home about. He really isn't.
Oh, you're mad that Gennady Golovkin is more important to Canelo than Jermall?
That he's still a bigger name, and it's for this reason that he gets more priority than a Jermall Charlo, than a Demetrius Andrade, than a David Benavidez. Is that what upsets you? Well, maybe it's because the guys you like so fucking much, they're not doing much to eclipse him, to outshine him.
Do you realize that Golovkin versus Murata is being billed as the biggest fight in Japanese boxing history?
American fight fans like Pretty Boy OD, they don't have to like it. They don't have to care. Their approval isn't needed.
Their money's just as good.
The money over there in Japan, hey, their money was good enough for Floyd Mayweather to travel over there to box a kickboxer named Tenshin Nasukawa.
You don't think their money's good enough for Gennady Golovkin?
Gennady Golovkin's core supporters aren't limited to a few guys here in the United States. Far from it. He's more of a global star than either a Jermall Charlo or a Demetrius Andrade. Put simply, he's a bigger name than they are.
American fight fans and their homegrown American fighters.
Their xenophobia, their tribalism, and their criticisms. They fall on deaf ears under the roaring crowds that cheer fighters like Gennady Golovkin and Ryota Murata on.
And their approval isn't needed.
Question is, why did Canelo Alvarez choose to box Gennady Golovkin for a third time as opposed to an Andrade, a Charlo, or a Benavidez? It's simple. It's because Gennady Golovkin's name is worth more here today than those guys' names are.
Friendo.
And finally, I'm sure most of you have heard by now, per tweet from Mike Coppinger via his sources, Vasyl Lomachenko agreed to a deal to fight George Kambosos, but he's working security detail on the Ukraine border. Efforts being made to allow Loma to leave for training camp so undisputed title fight can proceed June 5th in Australia.
It's not an undisputed title fight.
It's a great fight, don't get me wrong, but the other alphabet organizations recognize Heaven Daney as this division's WBC champion.
When you go to their websites, that's whose name you see.
Under WBC champion, moving forward, we would need a bit more clarity from Daryl Peoples of the IBF, Paco Vercel of the WBO, and Gilberto Mendoza of the WBA, and whether or not they actually recognize the WBC's franchise champion as the WBC's full champion in order to further qualify.
George is this division's undisputed champion.
Right now it's very murky. Mike Coppinger added, officials involved require that a Kambosos opponent be locked in by the end of March to allow for the typical 8-week promotional push, sources said. If there's no clarity regarding Lomachenko's ability to leave Ukraine by next week, talks will intensify with Heaven Daney. And my stance on that hasn't changed. I'm okay with either fight. I'm okay if George fights Devin. I'm okay if George fights Loma, though there is a big question as to whether or not Vasyl Lomachenko, will be given exception by the Ukrainian government and what remains of it during war times to leave the country in order to box a guy in Australia. I mean, these are extenuating circumstances, not just for Vasyl Lomachenko, but pretty much any Ukrainian man.
Any man age 18 to 60 isn't allowed to leave the country.
Not during war times, and that's what time it is over there in the Ukraine. So you really have to wonder as to whether or not Vasyl Lomachenko will be given exception to leave the country to participate in a boxing match. Priorities, people.
Who's he got to go through to get that exception while cities are being shelled to the ground?
I was surprised to hear this news when I heard it because I didn't even know that Vasyl Lomachenko would want to leave the country in order to box George Kambosos for those 3 alphabet titles and the WBC franchise belt at a time when his country is in peril. Though let's be honest, the fate of Ukraine won't be decided by...
The fate of the Ukraine don't rest on Vasyl Lomachenko's shoulders alone.
The fate of the Ukraine won't be decided by his presence or his absence.
There's really only one man that can end this war.
That's Vladimir Putin.
Putin.
Rasputin was said to have not had very good hygiene, though he had a way with the ladies.
Wrong Russian.
Better still, the fate of the Ukraine doesn't hang in the balance based on Vasyl Lomachenko being there or not being there, though I will admit I am surprised that this is even a talking point at this point, because at this point I figured, you know what, we're not going to hear from Vasyl Lomachenko.
We're not going to hear from him or Usyk or any Ukrainian athlete that's over there for a while.
Can he be given leniency? Can he be granted exemption as an athlete to travel abroad in order to compete in a boxing match? There's a very legitimate question there.
And could the conflict in Ukraine leave him distracted?
Even if he is given leniency and he's allowed to travel abroad to Australia to meet George Kambosos Jr. this summer, will this conflict in Ukraine not leave him distracted, and may that affect his performance? I mean, those are legitimate questions also.
I'll tell you, I was really surprised to hear this news.
You have to wonder if Vasyl Lomachenko knew that upon entering Ukraine during war times, he might not be able to leave. We're not hearing these same developments in reference to Alexander Usyk and his future plans, his future schedule. He was supposed to be boxing Anthony Joshua for a second time this summer, but I've seen no news, heard no reports or of them that Alexander Usyk has plans to leave the Ukraine so that he can meet Anthony Joshua for a second time.
We're only hearing this in reference to Vasyl Lomachenko, not Alexander Usyk.
Until further notice, we have to assume that it's not in Alexander Usyk's plans, his immediate plans, to leave the country to box Anthony Joshua for a second time. Until further notice, we have to assume that their rematch is still very much in jeopardy, and it may not happen.
Until further notice.
Until we hear otherwise, until we hear that Alexander, like Vasyl Lomachenko, may petition for an exemption to get out of the country so he can participate in a boxing match. Being honest, I don't know what's going to happen with this.
No, I don't know that they're going to let Vasyl Lomachenko leave.
I'm just as in the dark on this as you guys are.
Just have to wait and see.